Good morning. Thank you, Honorable Moderator. Let me start by thanking the organizers, the government of Bangladesh, the UNFPA, our colleagues, and who always give us great support in terms of the work that we do, thanks to Bobby, as well as PPD, who have invited us to speak here. So I would like to relay our thanks on behalf of the Director of the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. Let me just take 1 minute to introduce who we are. Some of you may know who the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation is and what we do. But very briefly, we were created in 1974 to help the member states implement South-South cooperation and also to build the capacity and coordinate the UN system towards supporting the member states. And so in terms of what we do, we are the secretariat of a General Assembly Committee on South-South Cooperation, which decides on the norms of South-South cooperation. And we also coordinate what we call the interagency mechanism on South-South cooperation, constituting of about 40 UN entities. After the discussions yesterday, I decided to change my presentation a little bit and have a kind of preamble to it because of some of the things that I had heard. Let me start by making about 4 points. I think the first point I wanted to make was that when we talk about South-South and triangular cooperation, it is important for us to understand these two issues. In the UN Office for South-South Cooperation right now, we are working on putting together modules for training on South-South and triangular cooperation. And so the points I want to make is there are two concepts. They complement each other, and there are two concepts. So when we're discussing issues like resource mobilization, data, and so on, it does not mean what you say about South-South cooperation is necessarily true about triangular cooperation. So that's the first point I wanted to mention. And then in terms of data, again, I wanted to make a distinction. Data for the kind of work that you do at PPD and UNFPA, you have the demographic data. And we've seen from the tremendous presentations that were made yesterday that the statistical offices are collecting the information and you have it at the tips of your fingers. But there is a kind of data that I wanted to talk about today, which is South-South cooperation data, or you could say triangular cooperation data as well. And that is the data relating to the exchanges between the partners on South-South cooperation. That is a different challenge because statistical offices generally don't collect that data. And then the last point I wanted to make, point number 4, is we're going to be talking about technology. There is nothing like South-South technology. It only becomes South-South technology when it's fit for purpose, when it's appropriate. For example, technology developed in a middle-income country may not necessarily be the right technology to use in a lower-income country. And therefore, those definitions are very important. What do we mean by technology? We mean appropriate technology for South-South cooperation. Now, Moderator, if I can move very quickly to the presentation. My starting point is a quotation by our director to the UN Office for at the UN Office for South-South Cooperation presentation during the G77 and China summit that took place in Cuba last year. And in the quotation that I have above, I wanted to mention that she mentioned that scaling up access and the transfer of technologies on mutually agreed terms is one of the things that we can do through South-South and triangular cooperation. Now, in terms of the quick objectives of this presentation, I'll just give a quick background on how the South has focused on technology, science and technology in the past. And then I'll go into talking about data, why data was not such an important issue for South-South cooperation in the past, and why this has changed. Indeed, there's a need for data right now. And I'll end up with some few recommendations on the way forward. The imperatives that are driving us to focus on data and technology is because we're faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, which we haven't recovered from. We have climate change, national disasters, conflicts, and we are not on track to achieve our sustainable development goals. That's why we need data to track the direction that we are going. So in terms of the importance of technology itself, I chose to select a quotation from the founder, rather the person who instigated the founding of ComSats, and I will talk about ComSats in a few seconds. And what is important is that he mentioned that indigenous capacities in science and technology must be developed. And secondly, that we must have relationships between the South-South, but also the North-South collaboration in terms of technological exchanges. And last but not least, he emphasized that the technical know-how is imperative for the generation and sustenance of these capacities in the countries. Now, I'll quickly go into the institutions that have been created for technology exchanges in the South. Not because they are the most important, but precisely because they've been created for that South-South exchange. In 2005, the G77 in China had their meeting, South Summit, and the outcome of that was the creation of an institution called International Science Technology Innovation Center for South-South Cooperation. And it is based in Malaysia, very similar setup to this institution. And the UN counterpart organization is UNESCO. So UNESCO supports this. They do a lot of training. They are particularly strong on STEM, and particularly on STEM for girls in education. So it would be a good idea if you're thinking of training of your people, the girls, to link up with them. Then there's the Commission on Science and Technology for Sustainable Development in the South, which was created in 1994. It's in Pakistan, and they have actually created a university on science and technology for the South. So it's another institution that you could relate to. I generally don't mention countries individually, but in 2000, the Republic of Korea, which was on the verge of becoming a developed country, paired up with the UNDP and the UN Office for South-South Cooperation to hold what was called the Forum on Science on South-South Cooperation in Science and Technology. And out of that, the Seoul Accord, you could visit that and look at it. It underlined the role of science and technology. And up to now, the Republic of Korea still acts as a bridge between the South and the North in terms of promoting technology. And then I wanted to talk about another center, the Center for Science and Technology of the Non-Aligned Movement and other developing countries, which was also founded during the non-aligned movement. So there's overlap, of course, between the non-aligned and the G77 in China, which is the Global South. And so I mention this because it's worthwhile to look at what they do when you are planning your own activities. But also, a lot of countries are doing things that are reminiscent of what they are trying to do. So if you don't get it from these institutions, you can get it from the countries. Now, let's leave technology for 1 minute and just go into data. I said I'm not going to talk on demographic data because I'm not an expert in that area, and the statistical offices, I'm sure, are doing an excellent job. But the challenge is on capturing South-South cooperation information. And the reason why there hasn't been an uptake on this is that for a long time, the countries of the North were not, they were not interested in a measure of cooperation that was not inclusive. And by inclusive, I mean that they wanted the measurement in kind flow of resources between the partners, as well as the financial flows. And up to now, they felt that the measurements mechanisms that were on the table did not serve this purpose. But now a number of countries have experimented on this, and we have the opportunity to really learn from them. Last year, the UN Statistical Office tasked UNCTAD with leading a process to come up with a measurement mechanism so that it could help in terms of populating the data on SDG 1.3, and then 17.6 and another one, as I recall. So I will not talk about the issues of use of data in depth, but suffice to say that the constraints not to use that data is that some countries still feel that it should be used as a tool to say so-and-so is contributing more than the other country. And this is really not the objective of collecting South-South data. The objective is to make sure that you know what the countries are doing, that you know which countries can provide what kind of support, so that you can make South-South cooperation better and more effective. And then the other thing is that for middle-income countries, they are relatively okay in terms of being able to do this. But for the lower-income, smaller countries, they may not have the capacity. So there's a need for the UN system, the regional commissions, to work very closely with them to try to build that capacity. And some of the statistical offices in those countries are keen to work on that. Having said all that, it will remain a very voluntary process to have the measurement. Now, going towards the end of my presentation, let's look at what has changed in terms of what I just described and the situation that we're in right now. Innovation is accelerating exponentially, except in the South. Some countries in the South are doing well, but a lot of countries are also falling behind. And despite that, there are beacons of success by individual countries on new technology, on adapting technology to their own uses. So again, we can learn from that. Now, in terms of concluding my presentation, because I know I'm running a bit over, I have about 6 points that I wanted to recommend, and I'll go very quickly over them. One is that as we go towards the summit of the future, we must not refrain from a fair assessment of what has worked and hasn't worked in terms of technology and data. And secondly, we should enlist the facilitating role of the United Nations Development System to accelerate technology, including artificial intelligence. I think the problem that countries make is that most of the time they tend to work with the counterpart UN institution in the country. Whereas what we need is really a systems approach where you can work with ITU on artificial intelligence, with the agencies that are working on financing, and the agencies that are working on your area, for example, population. We need to document and share positive experiences in collaboration and exchanges. An example of that is that we do it when we prepare the annual Secretary General's report prepared by the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. However, we cannot do enough because we are limited by the constraints of how long the document can be. We have to work outside that and make this. And we have the South-South Galaxy, which has got a lot of these examples in the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. And for those of you who are not already part of the South-South Galaxy, I hope that you can join us and you find that there's a lot of information that you can get. We should recognize the extensive existence of innovation, science and technology organizations and centers of excellence and work with them for mutual benefit. So as I said, I mentioned 4, but there are lots that are sponsored by countries. And we should visit the South-South Galaxy. I reiterate again, there is a lot of information. People have given us feedback that they have been amazed at the information that they get from other institutions, from the United Nations system, from member countries as well. And last but not least, we should also pull resources together for capacity building of countries that are interested in collecting data and yet are not able to do so. I will stop there because other colleagues are then going to make the discussions. I thank you for listening to me.